Hello, Internet friend. Today on Value Side, it's the consumer squeeze, how Americans are feeling the financial pain. I'm David Ravel. Well, every day new financial reports come across my desk, each one a specific measure of financial viability. Often these events are headline news, like the announcement this week of the Federal Reserve Chairman's latest decision on interest rates. More of that in just a moment. But first, we'd like to talk about two other reports, both somewhat obscure, but devastating in their effect on the American pocketbook. Let's take a look at this week's data. Now, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, perhaps the most authoritative government agency, announced that personal income rose 0.6% in March. That's a very positive result and indicates that the labor economy is humming along nicely, thank you. Companies are still providing raises, and employment is still trending positive. It's on the consumption side that we saw the real issues. I've provided a chart of a percentage change in income and expenditures for consumers, and it shows a dramatic increase in spending, the kind of day to day spending that everyday Americans need now to maintain their living expenses. It's something we haven't seen in a while, and broken down, it shows that ordinary citizens are barely trading water. We all know why this is happening. It's the price of gasoline is spiking because of the conflict with Iran. Since the Strait of Hormuz is blocked, U.S. gasoline prices have spiked. And this ought to show the fallacy of those, including the president, who predicted that this country, because we're net exporters of gas and oil, would not feel the pinch. But the price at which international gasoline trades is a very complex equation. For now, let's point out that Americans are paying 47% more at the gas pump than they were at the beginning of this year. It's now $4.12 versus $2.80 at the beginning of the year, and that this hike in gas prices is having a devastating effect on consumers' wallets. It has had the predictable effect on spending also. In that same BEA report, they indicate that people have begun to curb their driving, with gasoline spending down 1.4% in March. This reduction in driving will have a downstream effect if people stop going to the mall, stop going to the restaurants, or stop for entertainment, something we need to watch. Finally, one last note. All this comes with a strong labor economy. Wages and salaries rose in March, remember. Now, should income decline as it would in a recession, then this rise in gasoline costs would be punishing. Let's take a look at interest rates. In what had to be one of the most theatrical Federal Reserve meetings of all time, Chairman Jerome Powell announced no change in rates. They'll stay the same at 3.75%. All this came after President Trump cajoled Powell into lowering interest rates. When the chairman held his guns, Trump decided that he was spending too much on refurbishing the Eccles building, the Federal Reserve headquarters. This is an especially delicious accusation when one considers the projected and steadily rising costs for the president's own ballroom. Now, less than a week before the Fed meeting, Judge Jeanine Pirro closed the probe of Powell, enabling the Fed to proceed with its interest rate decision unfettered. It's been quite a show, with the president seeking to relax interest rates and thereby hoping to boost the economy. Now, it's easy to assume that the president and the Fed chairman are simply on opposite sides of the equation. The president wants a more relaxed financial policy, while the Fed chairman wants to hold the line. However, there is something we need to watch carefully because it may indicate that things aren't quite as black and white as they seem. Let me take you back to the great financial crisis of 2008. Wall Street had its back to the wall. If nothing was done to bring us out of this monetary abyss, we might suffer a real calamity, something that would resemble the historic crashes of the past. Now, fortunately, the Fed chairman at that time was Ben Bernanke, a Princeton professor who had spent his academic career studying the 1929 stock market crash. Bernanke, along with other members of the Fed and Wall Street, decided to inject billions of dollars into the financial system to bring us out of that monetary tailspin. In a process they called quantitative easing, the Fed provided banks and brokers with the capital to mitigate major institutional failures. Again, during the COVID-19 crisis of 2020, the Fed again injected massive amounts of liquidity into the nation's financial institutions through various programs and grants. Consider these as massive loans by the Federal Reserve to the country's entire financial structure. Now, as we all know, loans must eventually be paid off, and that's just what the Fed has done ever since. From a peak of roughly $9 trillion, the Fed has diligently paid down this loan until this year. And then beginning this year, the Fed has suddenly gone back to stimulus, adding to its balance sheet. In other words, the Fed is now injecting funds into the system as it did back in those other two crises. Although the amount is relatively small still, at $168 billion, well, small for the Federal Reserve, it does still raise questions. When an institution as hidebound as the Federal Reserve changes directions, it's worth noting. Let's keep an eye on this one also. Finally, in another one of those two-part reports, we led with the good news that housing starts rocketed ahead over 10% in March. And that's good news indeed. However, this is just the sort of behavior we saw during high inflation periods. Builders are anxious to purchase goods now and materials before the prices go even higher. What's more, the following report, that was building permits, fell to levels not seen since August of last year. So building permits, after all, are the first step in the home construction process. And this drop in permits should give us pause in spite of the fact that housing starts were up. Finally, I note that the final revision for Q1 2026 GDP rose by an outstanding 2%. I say outstanding given this environment. It was due in large measure, however, to the federal government's returning to work after that lengthy shutdown, you may recall. And that's today's Value Side. For all of our podcasts and articles, visit valueside.com. I'm David Ravel. Value Side is independently written and researched. The views expressed are strictly my own.